U.S. will take over the Gaza Strip, and we will do a job with it, too. We'll own it and be responsible for dismantling all of the dangerous unexploded bombs and other weapons on the site, level the site and get rid of the destroyed buildings, level it out, create an economic development that will supply unlimited numbers of jobs and housing for the people of the area.
So, Neil, now that we're not at Bibi and Donald's press conference listening to the craziest ass stuff in the world, how are you doing?
I'm hanging in there best I can. How about you?
Um, yes, totally hanging in there, and actually really glad that I didn't have to be a reporter in the room listening to what I think is possibly the biggest news of the week, which is President Donald Trump's crazy proposal to evict Palestinians from Gaza and transform that strip of land into, and I quote, a Middle East Riviera. Um, what do you think, Neil?
Well, I mean, people, first of all, should read your recent Substack about this because I thought it was an excellent overview of what's happening and also bringing us to the bigger picture. And also the fact that you called this quite a while ago during, I guess,
Thank you.
the first Trump administration, right? When like Jared Kushner's, real estate eyes were all over this land as a development opportunity. And so I think you're right in that piece to just point out that this is like an Overton window moment, right? Where he's just pushing, he's normalizing talk that seems outrageous and that, Lindsey Graham has done the right sort of, well, this is problematic type response to. But Lindsey Graham will likely be on a Sunday morning show in a week or two holding this up as sane, rational policy. And who knows where this is headed, but it's not good.
I agree. And part of what's interesting about this to me, too, is how the media has just sort of shifted back into another mode where Trump does something that actually, in terms of foreign policy, is just catastrophic. I mean, all the hostages are not even out of Gaza yet.
Right.
And here he is saying, oh, how about another Nakba? And I find it very strange that the media is just sort of reporting this as if it was normal. Apparently, nations around the world have condemned this statement.
Right. And I mean, I think this is going to be maybe a recurring theme of this week's episode which is like about the sort of tepid media response to this and to everything else. And also you have to feel for these institutions, these organizations, the reporters who are, I mean, those news organizations have been dramatically reduced by, stuff happening within that industry already. And now they're being hit with a fire hose of stuff that's coming out of this administration. So what can be covered in depth? I think it's part of the strategy of what Trump is doing, right? Is just to front load everything. And so that nothing really gets covered. But this seems something that like should have all boots on the ground when it comes to coverage of it. And I think having a better understanding of other countries' response to this and what it actually would mean, not only for the region, but for global stability, has to be a top priority of media organizations in the next month.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. So let's look at something else that actually hasn't been covered that much, which is on Monday, the white supremacist Enrique Tarrio, who was just pardoned by Trump, who should still be in prison for the next 20 years or so. Tarrio and the Proud Boys organization, who were integral to the January 6th coup attempt, lost the use of their name and logos to a black church that they vandalized during a pro-Trump rally in December 2020, right ahead of January 6th. The church was awarded $2.8 million in damages. The Proud Boys being the Proud Boys, they didn't pay up. So Judge Tanya M. Jones, Bossier of the Superior Court of the District of Columbia, has cleared the way for the church to collect any money made in the sale of Proud Boys merchandise. And I think this points us to something beyond the recklessness of the Proud Boys and their belief that they don't actually have to do anything anybody asks them to. Which is a lot of white supremacist organizations historically have really been about selling stuff, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like that there's money to be made around this stuff. And that I don't think that that's something that most people know or would think about when it comes to these organizations. But obviously, you have to like raise money and maybe even make money off of this stuff. And so this judgment seems to have undercut, a huge part of this organization's power, at least this organization's ability to exist. How it adapts going forward is going to be interesting. I also is this lawsuit going to be challenged? I assume.
Yeah, of course they will appeal it. And
Well, they
yeah, I
won in
mean,
the District of Columbia. I think it's worth saying. I mean,
right.
in a favorable judicial district, we know how much Trump really transformed the judiciary over his first administration. So I think one can imagine appealing this lawsuit and finding sort of a more favorable judge to hear their side of it. But it does point to the fact that I think, not only in this scenario, but and what we'll talk about, I think, throughout this episode today, the courts are going to be central.
Right.
And central in terms of, pushback to what the administration is doing, preserving what semblance of democracy we have. And also it's going to be just, I think, the battleground of where all this stuff plays out for 4 years.
Yeah, and what I would predict, and you can call me on it if I'm wrong about it, is that the appeal is based on free speech.
Right.
That they are going to say that taking their logos and their name is an infringement of their free speech. I would also like to point out to our listeners, and I'll include a book in the show notes for this. The Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s was explicitly a business that thrived not just on racism and violence against Black people, but on selling stuff, selling the robes, selling the logos, selling the flags, and so on and so forth. So that the guy that revived the Ku Klux Klan did it as a business opportunity.
Yeah. Yep.
So there's a history to everything. Okay, so let's turn to why the American left sucks. High-profile voices on the left, Bhaskar Sunkara, who is the editor of The Nation, are pleased to see DEI programs eliminated by presidential fiat. Why? Well, first of all, because they don't actually care about the rest of us, but also because they see the amelioration of racism as diverting Americans from what is really important, which is the recognition of class inequality, which is, of course, what is going to create the ultimate contradictions that create a revolution and bring us all to socialism. Neil, what do you think?
Well, I think, first of all, I don't think they're wrong to point out the way in which corporations have used DEI, in part potentially as a cover, and that it has also protected them from more extensive evaluations of corporate practices and corporate capitalism writ large, and also how it's probably armed them in anti-union pursuits, in the last decade. That said, the sort of celebration of this in this moment, and given our political context, feels akin to some of the calculations and strategies and celebrations that the left was doing during the campaign about what it would mean for Harris to lose the presidency around issues of Gaza or other things. And now we're seeing the horrific consequence of that. So it just feels like really ill-timed to be drawing attention to this and celebrating this as if there's some sort of potential path forward that's more radical.
Right.
I don't know. Tell me I'm wrong, Claire.
No, I actually think you're right. And I think you're pointing us toward two things that are really important here. Again, looking at the lack of reporting on some of these issues. DEI now appears in news stories as if we all know what we're talking about.
Exactly.
And they represent very different kinds of programs in very different kinds of organizations, some of which are annoying and some of which are really useful. DEI on the right certainly folds in traditional forms of affirmative action, of which yours truly was a beneficiary in the 1990s when departments had to make good on the legal requirement to hire women. So I think there's very little reporting on what DEI is and how it functions in most places. And there are corporations that have come out and said, actually, we are better and smarter and more profitable because of our DEI commitments. And so I think we need to know more of that as an American people. I think the second thing that I look at is the other person other than Sankara, who was mentioned in this article, is a former aide to Bernie Sanders. And it points out to me how the media has not made any effort to differentiate between the Democratic Party and socialists who occasionally affiliate with the Democratic Party, as the Sanders campaign did, but actually don't believe in it as an institution and don't have its values. And really, the importance of racial equality and gender equality and LGBT equality became incorporated into the Democratic Party in the 1970s. Feminists became incorporated into the party by 1972. So this is a really important history, and it is something that is completely disregarded by American socialists who use the Democrats when they feel like they want to, and then scorn them when they feel like they don't need them.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to sort of say a little bit more about your first point because I think it ties into a conversation we had in our last episode, just talking about sort of the slipperiness of the DEI invocation, right? And also coupled with, as you point out, a real like underreporting around this issue. And so, as I think we talked about last time, DEI has become the new woke, which is the new socialism, which like these are these umbrella terms that
Right.
the right is invoking to mean anything and everything. But I think what's going to be interesting is just to keep it on the sort of corporate, through the corporate lens. You know, you see some corporations are saying they're abandoning their DEI offices or their DEI strategies. Others are doubling, like Delta have doubled down on it. I think that there's probably also a third path that a lot of corporations are going to pursue, which is that they get to sort of officially say they're disbanding their DEI practices, but they work them through other departments in their organization. They sort of give them different language that fits within their sort of internal vernacular, and that they maintain a lot of this stuff. And I think on one hand, that's good in terms of diversity and equity opportunities within corporations. On the other hand, I think it's a real abandonment of a cultural politics that has been important,
Right.
and that serves to do more than just, shape hiring decisions within corporations, but I think has sort of helped set a larger cultural milieu that has been important in this last decade or so. And I think like the cultural reverberations around the sort of capitulations to Trump and Trumpism is very concerning. But I do wonder if these corporations are going to find some sort of third way where they, again, get rid of the like names, they get rid of maybe the person in charge of DEI on their corporate boards or whatever, but keep a lot of these practices in place.
I think
By
that may
other
be
names.
true. Yeah. I mean, we're going to see the disappearance of certain kinds of things. Like it was in the news this morning that the Defense Department has ordered West Point to get rid of a whole group of clubs, Asian
Yeah.
American clubs, LGBT clubs, blah, 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 that they just need to disappear. And that alumni of West Point are saying, but wait a second, these institutions were really important to teaching me leadership skills that I would not have otherwise learned. And it'll be interesting to me to see where the pushback is. I mean, I would say, as somebody who is almost 67, men are different now than they were when I was growing up. And that's all about feminism. It's all about the gay rights movement.
Yeah.
It's all about really nuanced conversations about race and masculinity that really were not happening before the 1970s. And so it'll be interesting to me how many people who are moderates and even conservatives start saying, well, wait a second, this is valuable. This is valuable training. This is what we call leadership. And you can't separate that from the bodies that leaders come in.
Right. If you have veterans groups, a Hispanic veterans group, for example, that is
Right.
coming out and saying this was, fundamental to our ability to, make our way through this institution and to continue to serve. I think I mean, I would imagine that resonates a little bit differently than, an other organization doing it. But we'll see. And I think you're right about the larger transformations of the workplace and of culture that are tied to things like, the history of feminism, the history of the LGBTQ rights movement. But I wonder what's the sort of surprising actors in our current moment um, might help retain some of these enormous historic transformations that aren't necessarily from the progressive side of the field.
I think that's really interesting, particularly as these very sort of clumsy ideas about identity, who don't use the name identity. For example, Trump's EO about protecting Christians from discrimination. Well, there's a fair number of Mormons in Congress. And what are Mormon Republicans thinking about this elevation of Christianity?
Yes.
And for listeners who don't really pay attention to these things, to be a Mormon is not, in fact, to be a Christian. It's a different kind of sect. Maybe you can explain it better than I can, Neil.
I was going to say, I mean, just see my first book, my first book is about the history of the religious right, but it really foregrounds religious division and the history of religious sort of tensions and animosities among evangelicals, Catholics, and Mormons, and thinks about how those shaped the rise of the religious right and also its political limitations. And I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I just saw the piece about the executive order yesterday, and to make it, and I've argued this before, that religious liberty has often served historically as a cover for the protection of evangelical Christianity in this country. However, it's always been fairly subtle and not on the nose in the way that Trump just made it. And so, yeah, I mean, you would think that Mormons, maybe not right now, but in the application of this, may start to really bristle at the real implications of what this spells out. We shall see. But, just to keep it in the sort of vein of religious objection, I mean, this is what I'm also thinking about in terms of the earlier discussion about pushback. I mean, I receive PR emails all day, and a lot of them come from conservative religious organizations. And I've been struck by how many of them this week have been pushback to the executive order about ending USAID, because evangelical ministry groups and evangelical humanitarian organizations depend on USAID dollars to do lots of their work, and to see a sort of a conservative evangelical coalition coalescing right now as pushback to this particular Trump order is important. It's significant. We'll see what grows from it. But I do think, again, it suggests that there are going to be some perhaps surprising and unpredictable actors here and resistors here. And whether they hold to that or whether they fold to pressure, I don't know. But World Relief Organization, the largest evangelical humanitarian organization in this country, I don't think that they're going to sit back on this issue.
Right. I agree with you completely. And I want to add to the list of potential resistors here, Catholic organizations. Catholic Charities is really one of the biggest organizations in the United States. I'm sure they've been hit with the funding freeze, but they are a global organization. And I have seen Catholic Charities people pushing back. And so, yes, there will be unlikely resistors. I'm also seeing a variety of people from the Bush administration fulminating on the NewsHour and on other venues, people who are the kinds of conservatives that you and I would have been picketing back in 2004, who are just enraged about the loss of USAID. Well, since we're there with USAID, let's be clear. The Trump administration keeps saying, well, they're not getting rid of it. They're just folding it into the State Department. And Secretary of State Marco Rubio, otherwise known as Lil Marco, is the acting director of USAID. But we just found out the other day that he's also the acting director of the National Archives, which apparently happened only a couple of days. It was in that flurry of EOs, I guess, that the Secretary of State was made acting director of the National Archives. I haven't seen any reporting on this at all. Neil, have you?
No, not at all. I was alerted to it by you. Again, I mean, how can the media keep up with everything that's happening? And probably this is not a top, certainly not a top 10 news item, but also not insignificant either. Um, I think, you and I were talking about beforehand that Rubio is the one choice here that sort of, I don't know, that we feel okay about.
He's a normie.
He's a normie. He's an adult. He's the adult in the room. I mean, I just saw this thing on Twitter, and it hasn't been like officially reported out, or at least there hasn't been an article about it. But this is from Jennifer Bendery, who's the political reporter for HuffPost, and she tweeted, this was yesterday or the day before, that she asked a seasoned State Department employee how Marco Rubio has been received so far, and they responded, "He has a minder, like a Trump campaign minder." Someone
Wow.
in his office, not of his choosing, like with Tillerson, they sent somebody over because he wasn't totally within the fold. So I think, again, for all the, the hopes that we have that he is the normie, he is the one adult in the room, he may be the adult with someone with a complete Trump loyalist handcuffed to him. So we'll see how Rubio performs as he moves forward. But the National Archives being folded into the State Department, I don't even understand that organizationally. I do wonder, like, when Elon Musk walks into the archives and sets the Constitution on fire in a live stream on X or on Twitter, like, is Susan Collins going to once again say that she's very concerned and we're just going to proceed forward? Where's this headed?
Right. And what will the New York Times headline be? Elon Musk says National Archives warmer than usual. No, I totally agree with you. And of course, as historians, we care deeply about the National Archives. I would also like listeners to know that one of the things that happens at the National Archives, and it happened more frequently after the Clinton administration, is that when the presidency changes hands, they often send Justice Department people into the archives to reclassify things.
Mm-hmm.
And so classifications and reclassifications and declassifications are constantly happening at the National Archives. So I think the best we can hope for here, first of all, is the archivists who work there hiding things and misfiling things and losing things. But also that things will simply be classified and not destroyed, which of course would be against the law, but who gives a shit about that anymore in the White House? Okay, so here's my surprise for you, Neil, before we head into resistance. I found out this morning that there is a striptease starring Secretary of Transportation Sean Duffy circulating. I will actually have a link to it in this piece that he did when he was on that reality television show, The Real World Boston. He is almost completely nude. At one point, he's holding a T-shirt over his junk. And then it ends with him, how to put it, farting into the camera, after which all of his friends begin to nickname him Ass Rocket, which, as you know, a comedian on the internet said, at least it's transportation related. Neil, what do you think? Here we have the Secretary of Transportation doing a striptease on the internet.
I mean, first of all, I watched The Real World Boston, I don't know, 30 plus years ago. I did not remember this particular scene, but of course
it was probably cut. I don't think it's the kind of thing you can broadcast, except of course on the internet.
Right. Yeah. It probably definitely didn't meet 1990s cable standards. But now in the age of the internet, anything goes. So, I mean, I've always obviously remembered that Sean Duffy, like, this is where his start was, and this is who we have in this position. I imagine this, I mean, this doesn't matter at all, right? Shame has no place in American politics and American culture anymore. I mean, I think every time a photo is shown of Melania Trump and some of the stuff she did back in the day,
right.
I mean, on one hand, I think it's really gross to bring that up. And also, this is the person that the Republican Party, is married to the president of the president of this country, and that Republicans revere. Everything is upside down. But no, I imagine, has Duffy responded yet? If he does, it's going to be liberal media, right?
Right.
Is
I
taking
have
the
I have
baton.
not seen any response so far. I expect the response of the GOP and its various minions on X will be, well, Pete Buttigieg was gay, so
Right.
what's the difference?
Yes, these are equivalent scenarios.
Well, and the part, of course, that is so, I remember when Pete Buttigieg ran for president, and I was just disdainful. I was like, I want a gay president, but I don't want this gay president. I don't want a McKinsey president, blah, blah, blah. Well, Pete Buttigieg has risen in my estimation dramatically, not just by comparison to these bozos, but because he was an excellent Secretary of Transportation. And he's a dignified, lovely man and a good parent with a lovely husband, and so on and so forth. And Sean Duffy is just an idiot. We can, of course, now call him Secretary Ass Rocket, always. But other than that, I just sort of feel like these things are just going to keep coming out.
Oh,
And,
absolutely.
and they, in many ways, disguise the truly terrible things that are happening.
Yeah, and I think that's important. I mean, those two things are very true. Like
Yeah,
these are the folks who are left to be in a Trump administration. These are the folks who would be attracted to
right.
working with someone like Trump. So obviously, there's going to be a lot of skeletons in those closets. Um, and then, what was your second point?
That Pete Buttigieg is just a lovely human being, and that there will be these equivalencies, that
Yeah.
will be the defense.
Yes.
In the Biden administration, they had Pete Buttigieg,
Right.
who, as I say, is a lovely human being and a good family man and a really dignified person. Uh, so, all right. So let's switch to our main topic today, which is the resistance. And partly I wanted to do this today, Neil, because I'm seeing stuff all over social media where people are saying in this really underinformed way, why aren't the Democrats doing anything? Why are all these things happening and nobody's responding? And I don't know what your response is, but I am seeing pushback all over the place. And so I guess I wanted to start with why people have this impression. What is different this time around than, say, 2017, January 2017?
Well, I think we haven't seen that full scale, like people in the streets response that we saw, like with the March for Women, in the first Trump administration, or the Women's March on Washington. I can't remember what it was actually called, but that sort of full scaled public visible protest. And also, I do think that like a lot of the Twitter is capturing like Democrat like Schumer and other Democratic senators and congresspersons sort of saying they're concerned or that like we have to stop this. And in our digital moment, our social media moment, it just seems like it's almost like a knee-jerk response for everyone to take those things and tweet, do something, or why aren't you doing something,
Right.
that sort of doesn't take in the full scale of resistance. And I have to say, I've been tempted to I've been in that camp a bit in the last 2 weeks, and certainly in text exchanges with friends. But I was really heartened by the piece that you shared, that I'm sure we'll link to in the show notes, from the New Republic, that really,
Mm-hmm.
I think, reframed this and said, first of all, there's an ongoing resistance here. We have to sort of identify how it operates in places that maybe are not as visible as we expect, and also to think about sort of different actors than just congresspersons, but that there's a bigger there's a wider sort of swath of resistance here that is at work, and that was comforting to me, even as it seems like right now it's not enough.
Yeah, I agree with you. And the organization that Melissa Jarrett Grant was writing about in the New Republic was Indivisible. And that is an
Yes.
organization that formed during the resistance to the first Trump administration as an attempt to pull a range of groups together in one national organization. They had 20,000 people on a call last
Yeah.
Sunday.
Yeah.
That's an awful lot of community organizers in an awful lot of communities. Um, and so I would say that the reports of a collapse in resistance are premature. In many ways, I think a lot of people I know are just exhausted. They're exhausted from the first Trump administration. They're exhausted from getting Biden elected. They're exhausted from 4 years of watching the Biden Harris administration fight against an increasingly intransigent GOP. They're exhausted about not seeing Trump go to jail. And so there is this sort of pervasive sense that nothing works, when in fact, and see what you think about this, Neil, the things that do work, like lawsuits, and we should talk about some of the lawsuits, are often not very sexy, you
Right.
know? And let me just toss this one thing in. I was interviewing somebody who runs an organization for undocumented women a couple of months ago. It was before the election. And I said, what are you going to do if? And this person pointed to a pile on her desk of lawsuits that they were ready to file. Um, Court motions, habeas corpus motions, blah, 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 that they were ready to file if needed. And so I think a lot of lawyers have been planning for a long time. And as I say, that stuff's not sexy.
Yeah, it's not. And, there was also the article that was talking about how a lot of this is being led by state attorneys general.
Right.
And that they were like ready to go with this stuff. They had started putting the stuff in place and they are ready to go as things come up that they've anticipated. So I think, as we said before, like the courts are going to be the battleground as we deal with this stuff in the coming years. But those things move slowly. They're not as sexy or as easy to follow stories as some others are. I also think that, just as a reminder of, one of the sort of dominant messages or the dominant conversations, I won't even say on the left, but in the non-Trump world of this country, between election day and inauguration day was, people, prepare yourselves. That this is a marathon, not a sprint, and that you have to sort of prepare for the next 4 years. And so I think if that was a big message leading into the inauguration, the expectation that everything is sort of responded to and is fixed or not even fixed, but everything is responded to and attacked within the first 2 weeks isn't really in keeping with that sort of longer vision of how the resistance works in this go around. I mean, my worry though is how much the Trump administration is able to get done before the real mechanisms of resistance, respond, because we are seeing him gut basic norms and key institutions. And I do worry about what's left by the time there is an organized resistance to a lot of this stuff. But I mean, maybe the lawsuits are still a good place for that to play out.
I think the lawsuits have probably been well coordinated. I mean, one of the things I've seen, for example, is that a group of Quakers has sued to protect houses of worship from searches by ICE agents. And that pleases me so much. One being that, Quakers have really, since the time of slavery, been the one religion that consistently, or religion of, that was founded and largely populated by white people, that consistently pushed back against all kinds of violence. But also, like, really, the Trump administration is going to go after the Quakers. What does that look like?
Right.
Yeah. So I love that one. A transgender woman has sued to prevent her transfer to a men's prison. So that has blocked those transfers for now. I think, in a funny way, Trump's own legal strategy, delay, is what at least these legal teams are going to use against him. The longer you can delay something, it's not that there isn't going to be damage done in the meantime, including, as far as I can tell, a lot of these stays are simply being disregarded by the Trump administration. But the longer you can keep it from becoming law, and the longer you can keep it from becoming the norm, the more the Trump administration has to deal with. I mean, they're going to be spending their time fielding lawsuits and not doing the work they want to do, which is destroying all of us.
Right,
Uh,
right. And I also
so,
think that this speaks to, again, one of the big themes of this episode, which is like all the attention and understandably, but so much of the headlines and the focus is on the issuing of these executive orders. I think people are not aware of how many of these have already faced legal pushback, legal
right,
challenge, how much of them have already been, tied up by a stay. And that's certainly not, I think, out. Those aren't headlines,
right.
and let alone are they sort of, I think, permeating people's consciousness about where things stand right now. And I don't think any of us should sort of grow. I don't think any of us should not worry and not be vigilant in this moment. But it would be nice to have a little bit more recognition of the fact that not everything is going as planned or as Trump would hope in terms of all the executive orders. But the executive orders are really, I think, top of mind in everyone and sort of the whole story, and I think a lot of people's heads, and that's obviously not the case.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think it also points to another kind of resistance, which involves you and me, Neil, which is getting information out to people so that these much bigger things become concrete and connected to their lives. I was watching one of Heather Cox Richardson's videos, and she was saying, Elon Musk now has your social security number.
Yeah.
You really need to focus on that. And I was thinking, I file our taxes electronically. So Musk has both of our social security numbers. He has our bank account numbers because we do electronic transfers to pay our taxes.
Yeah.
He has our address. He has he's got all of that. And there's no telling what he's doing with it. So making that personal makes real the class action lawsuit from a federal union representing 7.2 million people who live in blue states and red states that are alleging violations of the Privacy Act by DOJ. So I think people like you and me have a role in reaching out in ways that we're doing right now to say to people, this is how this affects you. This isn't just about the collapse of democracy. This is about the collapse of any sense of privacy you may have to any business you do in the world.
Yeah, I mean, this is anecdotal, but I wonder if you've observed this too. But I've been struck in the last week or so of seeing, like, on my Facebook page, which I barely go to anymore, but I think is an interesting way to sort of take a barometer of just, I mean,
Right.
like lots of, it allows me to access like types of people and communities that in my normal life I don't really cross paths with as much these days. And I've been struck by how many of my friends that I would not regard as political people and not as like news hounds like myself have really made their Facebook pages sites of protest and sites of resistance, and also sites of information where they're sharing stuff along the very lines you're talking about,
right?
And where they are seeking out information from sources like Heather Cox Richardson and similar that I think are rising up in this moment as traditional media institutions are not, or those are not the places they would normally access. And so I've really been encouraged by that, because these are not people I would regard as liberal, let alone political, let alone, but are truly concerned. And I think that is, as much as that's just an anecdote, I'm hoping that that's also representative of what's happening in like lots and lots of communities and with lots and lots of different people who are waking up and informing themselves, and that'll be the basis of any sort of real powerful resistance we have going forward.
Yes, I agree with you completely. And I think people are now saying it's the courts. But I also think it's a question of reclaiming the culture and reclaiming a certain way of thinking also about political compromise. I mean, the post that you referenced earlier that I sent out yesterday, I put it on Facebook and somebody wrote underneath, which I expected, Are you really chastising Arab American voters for voting for Trump? Frankly, yes, because sorry as I am about the tragedy in Gaza and the pain that has inflicted on hundreds of thousands, millions of people, and I am deeply and profoundly sorry about that, voting for Donald Trump was not the answer to the problem. And we've gotten to a point in the Democratic Party where people seem unable to compromise in a way that seems very driven by social media. It's so easy to put up on social media, this is my position and I'm sticking to it, and screw the Biden administration. I'm not voting for Harris, or I will vote for Harris, but I won't work for her. And it's like, well, how did that work out? How is that really working out? And I think getting people to think about how all of these things go together, that the only route back from this political disaster is politics.
Mm-hmm.
you know so I do want to say one other thing that's really important for people to know. New York's Attorney General Letitia James has warned hospitals that denial of care to transgender youth violates state laws. The Trump administration has said there will be no more gender affirming care for trans youth. Letitia James says, not in my state. And it's interesting because a lot of states have sort of backed off in advance of anything specific coming from HHS or the Department of Justice. And again, an attorney general like Letitia James has been out front to say, you know, you will actually continue to provide the care you're legally obligated to under our state laws. And that is a form of resistance too.
Yeah, for sure.
Um, but let's get back to the grassroots groups ever so briefly. What are they doing to help get people motivated and activated beyond demonstrations? And there have been demonstrations, actually. There in 5 or 6 major cities. There have been demonstrations that were quite significant. There was a major demonstration in front of the Treasury Department in which people like Chuck Schumer and Elizabeth Warren showed up and yelled a lot and so on. But what else can we do to resist, Neil?
Well, one thing that's really struck me is the coordination and the communication of how to contact your senators and your representatives. Like, I have seen so many friends sharing different resources that these activist groups are putting together of, like, here are the scripts you read, here are the numbers you call, here's
Right.
the plan of action, here's how you go about this. Call, don't email, this, not that. Go to, I was reading this one yesterday about that was really saying to prioritize finding out when your congressperson or your senator is holding a local town hall, and to show up for those, find out what the schedule is, show up for that. And also, just real strategic directions around, this is what you do with the local office, this is what you do with the Washington office. I think that sort of communication of grassroots activist strategy that's being disseminated right now is critical for the moment we're in. And again, I'm just so encouraged by seeing, just again, anecdotally, seeing so many of my friends that really, I think, span the spectrum of political engagement and involved in that very thing right now. And so I think that's been a huge thing that they've given us out of the gate.
I agree with you completely. And just to underline what you said, your congressmen and your senators actually care what you think. Even if they disagree with you, if
Absolutely.
they get a wave of people calling and saying, I don't like this, this isn't fair, I don't want you to vote on X, it is a steady drumbeat that reminds them that MAGA voters are really the minority, and that Donald Trump's money and influence and Elon Musk's money and influence may not be able to protect them in a primary. So I would encourage, especially those of you who have Republican representatives and Republican senators, to keep calling, keep writing, keep saying what you think. And as you're saying, Neil, show up at town meetings and show up well informed with an agenda that you want to push.
Yeah, and yes to all that. And also, I was really impressed by something I read that was saying, and also if you have Democratic senators and
Right.
representatives, you need to push on them too right now.
Yeah.
Because,
Yep.
I was like, well, I live in Los Angeles. Like, who am I supposed to, but that in this moment, everyone needs to know, they need to hear, so that both, Republican leaders are aware that they don't serve a completely Trump constituency, but also that so that Democrats are emboldened
Right.
towards action right now. So, and I think about like the two books I've written. I know in both of the books I've written, there has been at least one, if not several events I've written about in which one of the like hinge moments of some big legislative battle is Congress, Congress. Congressmen and women being deluged with
Right.
calls from, and really all the times I'm writing about are conservatives, and
Right.
conservatives have made use of this tactic much more when we look at the history of this stuff. But I think anyone who wants to do something right now, this is probably the very best thing you can do. It takes 5 minutes. You can do it daily, and it has direct impact.
Yep. Agree 100%. And I want to mention one last form of resistance that we're seeing, which is that there is a fire hose of leaks coming out of Washington and coming out of all of the offices that the United States government maintains around the world and around the country. And I'm seeing journalists on Blue Sky and X saying, get hold of me on Signal. If you have something to say about X, Y, or Z. And I'm seeing reporters coming up regularly with inside information, tipping us off to things before they're actually planned in the White House and so on. So if you are a federal worker, if you're any kind of a government worker, if you work in a police force, if you work in a firehouse, anywhere you get information, if you see something happening, call a reporter. They'll vet it for you, and they will collect it. But it's really important to keep each other informed. The flip side of this is, of course, apparently Elon and Donald are very worried about all this leaking, so they are putting finks all over the place, planting people to try and identify the leakers. But I would say we're all pretty good at communicating without leaving a trail nowadays, aren't we, Neil?
Yeah, I mean, that article, I found the sort of Trump Elon response to handling this chilling and scary, and certainly worried about those folks who are going to be even all the more surveilled. But then you think, well, if a lot of resources and energy is being devoted to this sort of stuff, does that also sort of undercut the other things they're doing? And is that part of
Yep.
the larger strategy here, which is just to undermine the efficiency of what this administration is able to get done, which honestly shouldn't be that hard because these are
That's right.
like, people who love to pronounce things but don't really know how to execute on stuff. And so,
That's right.
yeah, if they want to take their time setting up some sort of internal like mole system, that's taking attention and energy and resources away from other stuff. So
Absolutely. Absolutely. So here's a prediction that you can check me on a few months from now. I bet in the upcoming governor's race in Virginia, a Democrat wins. And I bet Virginia goes bluer than ever because really you cannot insult all these government workers and
yeah,
still keep Virginia and Maryland in your pocket.
I think that's right. And I also think that, we just had that, was there an election in Iowa, the Trump district?
Right.
I think he won by 21 points and the Democrat won in a special election by like a nice size victory. I mean,
Right.
any sort of things that happen, I think, in this 6-month period are probably going to be really favorable to Democrats. Sadly, we don't have a midterm for a while, but I think you're right there about Virginia.
Yep. The only way back is politics, friends. Okay, so Neil, what do we want to go viral this week? Why don't you start?
All right, what I want to go viral is a book from a friend of mine that has just come out, and my contacts are not working today, so I'm struggling to read the subtitle on my phone. But this is from Catherine Stewart. Honestly, one of the most important journalists of the last decade writing about the far Christian right. This is her third book that really investigates this. This one is called Money, Lies, and God: Inside the Movement to Destroy American Democracy. Catherine, like I said, has written two previous books about the far religious right, one called The Good News Club and the other called The Power Brokers, which are both terrific. This one's, its operating question is, why have so many Americans turned against democracy? And she is looking at really a 50-year history of the anti-democratic movement within this country. And she was looking at them in sort of conservative think tanks and Catholic activist groups and militia organizations, and really running the gamut of all the ways in which people and institutions have organized over the last half century towards this anti-democratic project. And it's terrific. It's really terrifying because to confront how extensive this network is, how well-funded it is, how deeply enmeshed it is with, I think, sort of mainstream conservatism, and now, how visible and active it is, and also how long this history has been, how long this history is, and how long it's been at work at this, I think is to be really terrified. But also, I think the more we know about this stuff and the more we're aware of the many tentacles of it, the better we all will be in terms of what we do in response. But this book is fantastic. Also, Catherine has a piece out in the New York Times today that is also excellent, that is, just calling attention to, I think that a headline is something along the lines of, they announced they were going to do all this, are we going to start believing them now? And basically, this has all been visible and something that
Right.
was out there for us to know. And yet, for many different reasons, we didn't think we had to pay attention to it. Catherine's book is paying attention to it, and so people should read it. It's out officially, I think, in a week, but go ahead and pre-order it. It's a fantastic book.
Thanks so much for alerting us, Neil. And just to say, listeners, there's now a Political Junkie virtual bookstore at bookshop.org. I'm going to put this book in it, and Katie's other books. Neil's books are in it already, as are mine. So you can go to the link and click on it and pre-order the book. So my thing that I want to go viral this week came out yesterday in the New York Times as well. It's by Timothy White, and it's called "My Father Was a Conservative Evangelical Pastor, Then I Came Out." And it was one of the most moving coming out stories I have ever read in my life, in part because it wasn't one of those, oh, my father was a bad, intolerant guy, and then he realized he loved me more than anything else, but rather because this father loved his son more than anything else to begin with. And it begins with this wonderful letter that the father writes on the day of his son's birth, and it's addressed to his son's future wife. And it's so lovely because it sort of sets out what I think is often behind a lot of coming out stories, whether they are wonderful or horrible, which is that parents imagine one life for their child that immediately disappears when their child comes out, and they have to recalibrate what life is going to look like. But what I was also very moved by in this story is that White describes his father as a man who truly loves God, and that his love of God and his faith are embracing of everything, so that when his son comes out, his response is not to say, this is against God, but rather, how can both of these things be true at the same time? How can my son be gay and I love God, who I don't think wants this to be true? And so the rest of the story is really his father's dialogue with the Lord, and how he ultimately comes to be an LGBT affirming evangelical pastor and watches his congregation sort of melt away and then return to him in some important ways. And so it ends with everybody having gone through a journey that is a journey of faith, but it's also a journey of love. And I found it deeply and profoundly moving.
I did as well. It actually was almost overwhelming to read in some ways. I had to sort of keep taking pauses from it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Obviously, like this felt very personal to me in a lot. I mean, maybe not obvious, but it felt very personal to me in a lot of ways.
Do our listeners know you were raised as a Southern Baptist?
Maybe they don't. Maybe no.
Okay.
And also, I think by the nature of how it's one of those interactive digital
Right.
stories that I think the New York Times does really well in a lot
Yes.
of examples, and this is certainly one of them. So you're seeing this text from the author, the young gay man, and then it's interspersed with pictures of the author and his father, as he was growing up through the years. But most importantly, it uses all these entries from his father's journal. His father was this huge journaler. And in the journal, he is wrestling with these questions and he's working it out in a deeply theological way. And so, first of all, I think, we've had lots of narratives about sort of people leaving the faith because of these crisis questions or crisis moments or crisis issues. But here's someone who maintains a faith and wrestles through this issue or this question in the way that he knows how to within the sort of his theological belief system. And to see that developed out not in snippets, but in actual full passages from his journals over the year, I think is just remarkable. It's an incredible piece to encounter, and it's remarkable also in terms of what it allows us as readers to observe.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I'm glad you liked it as much as I did. I'm going to be thinking about it for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
And it also allows us to end this video cast on a very positive note. Neil, I'll see you next Friday. Who knows what will
Sounds
happen
good.
next week?
Time will tell.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.